So I'm Sangeet Gellhorn. I was born 28th of August 1945, and today is the 21st of April 2016 in the Royal College of Music in London. Well, of course, my background as a musician was family. From high-powered German, Jewish, perfectionist musician on my dad's side, and on my mother's side, everyone sang, everyone did music, so amateur music making. My aunt was actually professional, but I mean, whenever the family got together, we sang, and still happens. We still do. I mean, so I had music on both sides of the family. I mean, growing up, I never thought about music. It was simply the air that you breathed. It was like part of the fabric of everything. So, of course, my dad being an opera conductor, I saw operas. I went the first time when I was 3.5 to Magic Flute at Covent Garden. My next opera was probably Figaro, but only the first 3 acts, because it was an afternoon performance and they didn't have time for the 4th act. So it was a few years before I actually knew the end of the story. And then I think I remember Trovatore. And I remember very vividly, I mean, I was sitting in the box and my dad putting me there and saying, I'll come and see you, pick you up after the show. And that was normal. That was like Opera House was home. By the time I was 5, I was playing little pieces on the piano. I was not a prodigy by any means. My mother taught me a little bit. She played piano. And so I had my first lessons with her. But I think by the time I was 5 or 6, I was writing. I remember writing music. And so I was fairly literate. At kindergarten, I directed the band, of course. I mean, it was like, you're a musician. I mean, so wherever you go, you do it. When I was 10 years old, I went to a concert that my father had a chamber music group called the Court Ensemble, which was a singer, a flute player, a cellist, and he played the piano. And I went to one of those concerts when I was 10 years old. I remember Wilfred Smith, who was the piccolo player from the Covent Garden Orchestra, was playing the flute. I think Adele Lee was the singer, and Kenneth Heath was the cellist. And after that concert, I said to my dad, I said, get me a flute. And after a few things, a little bit of discussion, I ended up having lessons with Wilfred when I was 11. So flute was it was a wonderful instrument to play during school time, because you could play music with other people. You know, piano, I wasn't so good at. I mean, by the time I was 10, I was trying to play pieces that were too difficult. I remember trying to play Schumann Fantasy, and it probably took me 20 minutes to get through the first page. And I could play a little bit of a Schubert impromptu and stuff like that. But I was getting too ambitious. But the flute was a marvelous instrument, and I could do all sorts of other things and play an orchestra. And I was fortunate enough to have wonderful teachers. When I was 15, I went to Geoffrey Gilbert, and I studied with him for 2 years. And I ended up as playing in the National Youth Orchestra for a couple of years. I was principal flute for concert, I remember, under Sir Malcolm Sargent at the Festival Hall, and then we did a tour of Europe. We went to Warsaw, and we went to, I think we went to Switzerland, I think, as well. And then I had an urge that I knew I had to play the piano. And that was a struggle. I mean, that was a struggle. My father wasn't too keen on that. He saw I was a good flute player, and he said, you know, you should do what you can do, or either play the flute or be a mathematician, which was my other subject at school, because that's easier but I knew I had to learn the piano. And so I did that for, I went to Berlin, studied there, tried to get into the Paris Conservatoire. I didn't have the equipment, I didn't have the foundation to do that. Ended up finding a good piano teacher in London who gave me the basics of what I needed. Because I had some lessons with Dad, but he was the kind of piano teacher who would give you inspiration, but expected that you could play, kind of like Liszt. Wasn't interested in teaching you technique, but saying, well, the music goes like this, and get the idea, the feeling of it, and the expression of it. I went to Guildhall School of Music, did 3 years there, played. Well, in Berlin, I did my first public piano performances. I played the Bartók Studies and then the 1926 Sonata. When I went to Guildhall, had a better foundation, played the whole standard repertoire. After that, I went to York University and did a PhD in composition. And while I was at York, I taught piano. That helped cover the living expenses. I also had a grant from the Vaughan Williams Trust. In fact, the Vaughan Williams figured very strongly in my family because my dad, well, first of all, my mother went to St. Paul's Girls' School, where Holst was the music master. But if Holst was busy, Vaughan Williams would stand in. So he was her music master occasionally. Then when my dad went at the outbreak of war in 1939, he was interned. And you got out of internment depending on who you knew. And because of his work at Toynbee Hall, Vaughan Williams knew about him, and Vaughan Williams was somebody who wrote a testimonial on his behalf to get him out. And then I got a grant from the Vaughan Williams Trust to do my studies at York. And in that time at York, I played more 20th century music. In a way, I was trying to get beyond my father's comfort area. His comfort area really ended with Les Noces. I think, and anything I did, the sort of the Schoenberg school, the second Viennese school, he would argue against. Although later on he came round to having to do it with the BBC, but there was this sort of an emotional barrier to doing that music. So when I was at university, I ended up playing the Schoenberg Piano Concerto, which was like my way of stepping beyond that barrier. And then I had a school friend, Hugh Davies, who was very interested in experimental music and electronic music. And while Hugh was up at Oxford, I was still at school. We went to visit with Daphne Oram at her studio in Kent, in which I did my first electronic piece. That was 1962. Then Hugh ended up being Stockhausen's assistant. And I got very interested and involved with, well, the Stockhausen movement, and there was a group called Gentle Fire that performed improvised Stockhausen pieces. And I ended up with York. Richard Orton was the professor there, and while they were putting the electronic music studio together, I got involved in that and started doing really cathartic things. But it was actually the first time I felt, this is me. This is not me trying to imitate somebody else. And at the end of that, there was just a question mark. What do you do next? I had a wife, I had a child, and everybody was saying, well, you should get a job. And I was just feeling, well, all that stuff is old, and I've been there and I've done that. So the next stage in my life happened to be a connection with an Indian spiritual teacher who I connected with in England. His name, in those days, he was Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Now he's known as Osho. And, well, to make the story short, I ended up becoming a disciple of his in 1974. And that's actually where my original name was. I was christened Martin Oliver. And when I went to Bhagwan, he gave me the name Swami Anand Sangeet. And Swami means master in the sense of somebody who is master of himself. Anand means the bliss where you've transcended duality. And Sangeet means music. And when he gave me the name and said Sangeet means music, I went, oh, okay. I guess it's music. And during that first time in India, a lot of things happened, and I opened up and music started coming back. But in a different way, sort of in relationship to the energy of meditation. And after that, I suppose I had jobs in England. I taught at Falmouth Art School for a couple of years. Then I went to India. Actually, during that time, I taught electronic music at Goldsmiths College as well for a while. And then I went to India, and in India, I learned to improvise. I learned to let go of these little black dots on lines, that you don't have to be imprisoned by that. The music can flow when you just are. And I learned that with the flute. And then let's see, we had a music department in the ashram in Pune, which was very interesting, because we had a lot of top players from Western symphony orchestras. I mean, like the principal clarinetist from the Rotterdam Symphony was there. I remember playing Brahms piano trios with the A minor trio with him, the clarinetist, and cellist Harold, who at that time was the principal cellist of the Concertgebouw. You know, I mean, so there was quite good musicians who were learning to move into this area of meditation. And for a while, I led a meditation group, an improvisation group for all the classical musicians. And so we were doing a little classical music on the one hand, and then exploring energy and seeing how we could bring that back into the classical music. And that ashram ended in 1980. In fact, the energy got so big there that it was like we had to say, cool it. We need to move to a bigger space. In 1981, my spiritual teacher, Osho, he moved to America, and I followed in 1982. And then I spent the next 3.5 years on construction team, 3 years as a civil engineer, designing underground utilities, ended up designing a whole subdivision that we created. It was like the way the commune worked. It was like, oh, you're intelligent, go and do that. That's okay. I don't know how to do that. Oh, well, you can figure it out. You've got brains. And yes, you can visualize. And we did actually have one professional engineer there who I would go and get advice from. He said, oh, you know how to do that. Okay. Use your vision and use your intelligence. I mean, the way things happen, I was on a construction crew at one point, and I could see chaos happening on one of the projects, and I thought, my God, next time they do a project, I hope they have somebody to keep an eye on things. Watch what you think. Next project, Sangeet, go and keep an eye on things. So that was really the way the commune worked. It was an amazing experience, because the creativity. If you think we built a city for 3,000 people in high desert in 3 years, put in the entire infrastructure, built houses and all the rest of it. So, you know, I mean, I had written string quartets and wind quintets, and what happened, they went into a drawer, and if you're lucky, 3 years later, one movement get performed. To me, the process of designing, doing a site plan, was very much like composing, because you had these random elements that you had to put into form. You had to write a score, a plan that people could read and then execute. So there was a very similar aspect to that process. And, you know, Sangeet, we need to build a bridge here and there. We need a plan in 20 minutes. Okay, there's a plan, and 3 weeks later, there it is. So in music, I never had that quick feedback. Anyway, that whole thing that was the commune in Oregon. I was there. That ended in the end of '85, and then it was like, okay, I'm ready to be out in the world again, and music came back, and I ended up. We left the commune, and I went to San Diego. We drove down the coast, and it was like there was not really anywhere further to go, and I got a job playing piano for ballet classes, and that was how I got back into music after 3.5 years of. Oh, as well as being a civil engineer, I spent 8 months as a paralegal writing cases on constitutional law and RICO and things like that, because we got embroiled in a lot of lawsuits. Good experience for me. Very interesting, but nice to say thank you, been there. I don't need to do that anymore. So yes, I got back into music in San Diego, playing the piano, learned to improvise on the piano for that purpose. And at the same time, I came to terms with a lot of the music that I had grown up with. I knew that I had to look at the music that I had heard as a child. I played through all the opera scores that I had heard my dad perform or conduct, and basically to see what do I respond to? What do I need as part of my language? So that the whole of Western music wasn't a burden anymore. And then a couple of years later, I think the flute came back and I started playing for meditations. And that again was a different energy. And after San Diego, I went to Boulder for a short time. And from Boulder, like 23 years ago, it's now, I went to Hawaii. And I knew it was time to start teaching. I mean, in Boulder, I got the message that it was time to start teaching. And so I went to Hawaii, found myself teaching piano on all the military bases, 50 kids a week, mostly piano, a few voice students, a few flute students. And I made the group there that I made a spiritual connection with was a Sufi group. And I was invited to play flute for the Sufi dance, and it was like, oh good, there's my spiritual connection. So I did that every month for 8 years. And I still play for Sufi groups. I have friends who are whirling dervishes, and they like the turning, and I like to play for that, and because you can improvise and you can just do the energy. And about 15 years ago, out of being involved with the Sufi group, I was doing a singing class, or a music class, teaching people to sing. So I teach basic voice work and then how to read music and stuff like that. And there was one woman who was in the choir at the Unitarian Church and said, Sangeet, we're looking for a choir director. And I said, well, so what? And she said, well, what about you? And I mean, quite honestly, I'd always conducted automatically whenever I needed to. But watching my dad, I didn't want to be a conductor because I thought to be a conductor, you had to be a temperamental megalomaniac and go through everything. And it was like that side wasn't very attractive. But anyway, Unitarian Church showed up and I realized, that's something I'm supposed to do. So 2 weeks later, I'm the choir director at the Unitarian Church in Honolulu, not knowing what music to do, and I asked the minister, what do you do? And he said, well, anything you like. And I thought, well, okay, I guess Unitarian Church, Sangeet in a church, that's probably as good as anywhere. So I did 6 years there. I learned what music to do. They had conferences every year, Unitarian church musicians in America, and I made a lot of good friends and learned what kind of music you do. And I was at that church for 6 years. Then I had a little break. The singers came. We had a choir in my house, actually. They said, Sangeet, we're bored. What are you going to do about it? Okay. And then I got a job as the choir director of actually one of the biggest churches, of the Central Union Church, which was a marvelous thing. And I mean, and so many aspects of my musical past came out. When I was at high school, I was at Westminster. So Westminster Abbey was our school chapel. So I sang in the Abbey choir every morning for 4.5 years. So I kind of learned a little bit about English choral tradition. So I had that in my back pocket. And listening to all the things that my dad did and having sung in all the oratorios, we did a lot of music. I did 5 Messiahs, we did Symphony of Psalms and little pieces like that. Otherwise 2 to 5 pieces every Sunday. And it was a good enough choir that we had professional soloists to be section leaders, and so that was fun. Real fun. And that came to an end about a couple of years ago. So now I am free again, in a sense, and I do some workshops, I do some teaching, I do some piano playing, I do some flute playing, and here we are. So that says a little bit about my path. So it's been interesting because at times I have done exactly what my dad did. And at times I have moved so completely away. I mean, for example, when I was at university and I was doing electronic music, I mean, Dad was the most incredible supporter. He supported his family from the age of 13. He always wanted to give money. And I mean, a phone call with him, the first thing he would say was, do you have enough to eat? because that in his childhood was a very significant issue. So that was always, are you eating well? You know, that's the first thing. And he always wanted to give money. And when I went I was at York University and doing my cathartic Stockhausen electronic music, I knew that he didn't like that. That was not in his comfort zone anywhere. And so I said, look, I'm not going to receive any money from you because this doesn't work. I'm in a different world. I don't want to feel this kind of obligation out of this, and he was really upset. When I came back from India, he was very upset that I'd been to India because I was looking at somebody else as the authority, not him. Or at least that's the way he saw it. He didn't really understand what was happening. Then I started doing more the conventional stuff. I got a job at Falmouth Art School to teach electronic music, but they also wanted the conventional stuff too, so I taught flute and I taught piano and did things like that. And I said, okay, now I can receive from you again. And he was very, very happy. So it was like we've moved apart, we've moved together, we've moved apart. When I was, when my mother had her 80th birthday, I went to England and we played together. And I played flute and he played piano, and we played arrangements of violin pieces that I had grown up listening to him practice. And it was like, we really came together beautifully in the end. But it was a lot of work, quite a journey. When I grew up, when I was little, there was no awareness that music was anything unusual, right? I mean, it was just part of the air that you breathed. And my father was a conductor, and that, you know, I mean, it was normal. It was perfectly normal. I mean, I went to Covent Garden, I saw my first opera was Magic Flute when I was 3 and a half. And I remember very vividly going round to the green room afterwards, actually sitting in the Queen's chair. I hope she didn't mind. and meeting the singers and all that. And in fact, my mother told me that I had long conversations with Carl Runkel, and who was the music director then. And that was normal. I mean, there wasn't anything special about it. That was ordinary, because that was where we were at. And being with my dad, I was simply in the same place. So no, it wasn't that he was anything special. I mean, I knew he made a big fuss about things when he was conducting, and if things hadn't gone perfectly during a show, you'd know about it afterwards. But I mean, that was just where you were at. That was normal. I mean, I remember hearing years ago Daniel Barenboim saying that when he first went out into the street, or we remembered when he was at the age of 3 or 4 going out, and he was shocked because there were people there not playing pianos. You know, it's there's something missing. So no, I mean, music was just the air we breathed. I mean, that was just what he did. I mean, so there was no comparison. That didn't come in. I don't think he was really thinking about what I should do or not do when I was small. I mean, first of all, he was so busy doing his own thing. I mean, he was very interested in sharing his thing and saying he'd do a new piece and come and he'd play it, and he said, this is a new piece and this is interesting. And I mean, he was always eager to share. As I said, I had some piano lessons with my mother. I wasn't great. I wasn't a prodigy like him. So it wasn't something that he probably never ever considered that I would make a career as a pianist. When I played the flute, he could see that I was good. And I was good. I mean, but I didn't think about that. You know, I mean, when I went to Jeffrey, he would give me exercises and studies to do, and he'd say, and so you started practice that for a week, and so of course I'd go home and an hour every day I would practice and do everything, you know, because it's what you do. I mean, I think the main thing that I learned from Dad was that if you do music, you work from 9 in the morning till 11 o'clock every night. That's your life. And I remember him joking and saying sort of, well, music is what you do instead of living. But music was what his life was about. There was nothing else. He didn't know how to have a holiday. He didn't know how not to do it. I mean, so we would often go on holidays as a family, but he wouldn't come because he was staying home because he had work to do. You know, he was either practicing the Chopin F minor piano concerto to play for the ballet at Covent Garden, or we were on holiday and he's busy composing Star of Bethlehem, and he comes down for one day and then goes back to work. He didn't know how to have a vacation. That wasn't part of his existence. So I don't think he really thought about what I should do. I mean, music was there. I took what I wanted to take and then eventually made up my mind. And so I think all my life I've pretty much done what I wanted to do. I haven't taken too much notice of what anybody else thought I should do. And I think that served me quite well. Peter didn't talk very much about his early life in Germany. One intuited things from things he said. I mean, for example, I know nothing about his life in Breslau, except for the fact that he was born in Breslau. And Breslau, when I knew it, was Wrocław, and it was a Polish town. It wasn't his town of birth didn't exist anymore. And I knew a few stories about, I knew his mother because she came to London when I was 14 months old, so I knew her. I never met his sister. I met his father when he came back to Europe in 1955. I mean, he was Jewish. He left Germany in 33, went to South America, and I was aware of him, I think, because he sent stamps, very beautiful South American stamps. And he came back to Europe in 55, and my dad connected with him. So then sort of, oh, that's something that I could relate to in my life. I remember once I was having a piano lesson with him, and I was playing the E major sonata of Beethoven, Opus 14, and in the last, I think it's the last movement, it was the second subject, the ding, bom, bom, bom. It was like church bells ringing. And he said, yes, he remembered when he was 9 years old, in the flat in Breslau, when he played that, he would hear the church bells would ring. So all I know is that their apartment was near a church. But it's sort of things like that he never really talked much about that. He told a few stories about when he was in Berlin and again, usually related to work, or related to music and his connections through music. I mean, like for example, when he was a teenager, his father, Alfred Gellhorn, introduced him to Lotte Reiniger. And Lotte by then had already made Prince Ahmed, which in 1923, which is the first full-length animated movie ever. She and her husband Karl Koch. But somehow Peter and Lotte hit it off. I mean, it's just something happened. And that served him in many ways. I mean, later on he made music for her movies, and some of those movies we saw because Lotte and Karl came to England after 1948, so they were sort of like part of the family. And of course it was through Lotte that Peter got into England, that he escaped in 1935, that he had an invitation to come to England. That was through Lotte's friends. It was with Philip Lauritz and I think Lionel Robbins. I mean, Philip Lauritz was the one who wrote the letter of invitation which got him into England. He didn't dwell on the past. I mean, occasionally a story would come up. I mean, I can share a couple of stories that he told about his teachers at the academy in Berlin. He talked about his piano teacher, Richard Rössler. Rössler was, at one point, he was a pupil of Leschetizky. And another of Rössler's teachers was Heinrich Barth, who happened to be the teacher of Arthur Rubinstein, Heinrich Neuhaus, and probably a few others, other illustrious people. But Rössler made a name in the 20s playing Bach. which was very unusual. In fact, Peter told me, he said, yes, he played the whole of the 48 Preludes and Fugues in the Hochschule, played from memory. And he told me an anecdote that one day, when one of the preludes in the second book, they're all sort of ABA form. And so you finish the B section, and then you go back to A, and then you have to get out. He couldn't remember how to get out. So he went back and played the B section again, and then the A section again. And he still couldn't remember how to get out. So he improvised his way out. I mean, you know, I thought that's the kind of musician he was. And there was another professor who was sitting there following with the score, who came up to him afterwards and said, "Na, Herr Professor, das war sehr interessant. Sie haben eine andere Ausgabe. You have a different edition." I mean, so that does tell something about the quality of his piano teacher. Although I remember Peter talking about piano technique, and he'd been given, there's a marvelous set of piano exercises by Raphael Josephi, who was at one point a Liszt pupil. Liszt wrote a set of exercises, and then his pupil Tausig wrote a set of exercises, and Josephi in a way refined them, and they are marvelous. I recommend them to any pianist, if you're careful. You know, do them right. But he was talking about this Josephi exercises and said, my teacher says here, the fourth finger it's really useless, and this is useless, and this is useless. Really, all the fingers, they're all useless. I thought this is a very odd thing from a piano teacher. But Peter obviously picked up something tremendous, a tremendous energy about the playing of Bach, because he learned probably as a teenager or a student there. I mean, he played the A minor English suite with a drive that, you know, woke you up, and the D major partita. I mean, marvelous the way he played. I mean, you know. So I grew up listening to that going on. His professor of conducting, Julius Pröver, was Furtwängler's assistant in the Berlin Philharmonic. And Peter finished his piano studies at the Hochschule, and then he went for the conducting class. And his entrance exam for the conducting class, Pröver said, "Okay, play something on the piano." So he had just done his piano exam, which included Beethoven A-flat Sonata, Opus 110. So he sat down and played Opus 110. And then Pröver says, "Okay, here's the newspaper, read the stock exchange reports and go on playing." Right? This is just your entrance exam to see if you're capable of doing that. And clearly he managed that perfectly okay. And then Pröver said, "Okay, good. Now transpose the Beethoven upper half step." And it was lovely the way Peter told the story. He didn't say he did it or didn't do it. He said, "But you know, if you transpose up into A major, the fingerings are all different. It's quite tricky." But obviously succeeded very well. Peter was one of the most biggest impressions I had as him as a pianist, was playing Liszt. He played Waldesrauschen, which is one of the late concert studies of Liszt. And that was one of his party pieces. And I remember, like, as a 10-year-old, sitting by his piano, he had a little armchair by his piano. And when he played, it was like the air, the molecules of the air shimmered. It wasn't a Stockhausen piece. Stockhausen did that too. But when Peter played Liszt, and I always thought that he got Liszt from his piano teacher. But actually Pröver, his conducting teacher, who as conducting was a conducting student of Hans Richter, was that part of the tradition, was a piano student of Arthur Friedheim and Moritz Rosenthal, who were Liszt's most important students. So actually the Liszt connection, that bit of the tradition, came through his conducting professor. That's about, and I mean, he said, Pröver, terrifying, he could hear the grass grow. No. He said, a big Strauss tutti, and he'd stop and he'd say, no, second clarinet has an E-flat. You know? I mean, he could hear everything, and so clearly this is the quality that he admired. But I think Peter was, while he was not a helpful piano teacher for beginners, he was an inspiration to if you could play. As a conducting teacher, he was fantastic. He could give you every little detail. He could show you exactly what you had to do to be clear, to how the beat, how you should shape the sound, how you would encourage people to play, how you should respond to different players, how you should do with orchestra, how you should respond to singers. And so I think his teacher was immaculate in that sense, and he really learned something fantastic. I don't remember him ever saying anything about his composition teacher. Not a word. He talked about going to Hindemith's lectures. He wasn't a pupil of Hindemith, but clearly Hindemith was the strongest influence. And so he did talk about that he had gone to lectures of Hindemith. And his music reflects that. It doesn't reflect the revolutionary things that were happening at the time by Schoenberg and even Bartók and Stravinsky. But clearly Hindemith was something important. I mean, his main feeling was was obviously to be playing the classics. I mean, the pianists who excited him were like Schnabel and Edwin Fischer, who played Mozart and Beethoven and Schumann, and that's where his heart was, I think. And at the same time, he had a great desire to be an opera conductor, so Verdi and, Mozart, of course. Mozart, Verdi and Wagner and those. Mozart was very interesting. I only realized later that I think there was a special transmission that happened between him and Fritz Busch. When after he came to England, Fritz Busch was conducting at Glyndebourne. Peter was invited to attend rehearsals, and somehow something happened there, because his approach to Mozart was not what he learned in Berlin. And I remember him saying that when he came to England, hearing Thomas Beecham, for example, he was shocked because it was so quick and bright compared with the dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da-da-da of Furtwängler. It was just a different world. And so he had to acclimatize. But I think the connection with Busch was really quite important for him, because, Mozart was, in the end, one of the most important composers. What is this like? What's the German hierarchy of gods? You've got Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner, and above them all you have Mozart. It's like in a different world. And I'm not sure that he got that as a student, but he certainly had that when I knew him, directly. Yes, he didn't talk very much about his compositions. I knew they were there. There was even, I forget whether it was the Capriccio for violin, which was published under the name Hans Fritz Gellhorn, because he was actually christened Hans Fritz. And then his father realized that he called every little boy Peter, but he hadn't called his own son Peter. And so, although he was Hans Fritz, if you look at his birth certificate, he's Hans Fritz. He was always known as Peter. And it didn't become official until he was naturalized British, and then he became officially Peter Gellhorn. But so that was curious, and that he had written, it was more interesting to me as a kid that, oh, Daddy has a different name. He didn't talk much about his composition. He would always say, well, the most important thing is to be a composer. But while I was a child, he wasn't active as a composer, and that I knew. Star of Bethlehem was the only piece that I actually remember him composing during my childhood. And I was much more of the time wondering if he feels that the most important thing is to be a composer, why isn't he writing more? But certainly, I think his understanding and his upbringing is that if you want to be a musician, you have to be literate and you have to write music. That's part of your... Doesn't matter if you want to conduct symphonies or operas. You're not a musician unless you can write a symphony or you can write this. So part of the skill the understanding of music comes from you writing it. I did the same thing. I mean, I guess I picked up that same belief because I composed and I knew that that was the way to get inside music. And later on, there wasn't the need or the drive to express myself in music. I mean, I could do that with the flute or with whatever else I was doing. I think his energy went into playing the piano. I mean, at the piano, that's where he was home. He was absolutely comfortable. He was connected. Spirit was there. In a way, his music room was the temple in our house, and the piano stool was the high altar, because that's where the energy was held. I mean, and I think for me, I mean, I saw that. I wanted to be there. I wanted to be in that energy. I mean, and that was probably why I needed to play the piano. But in the end, I got the understanding of the connection through going to India and doing meditation. But he had it. It was there. I mean, he'd sit at the piano and play Mozart, and Mozart was there. He'd play the Schumann Fantasy, and Schumann was there. I mean, there was no question. I mean, he was the music. It was there. There was nothing in the way. And so that the energy of that, sitting at that Bechstein, that was like the most sacred place that existed. And in that place, he was happy. You could see that. You could see that he was completely at ease and comfortable and everything was right. When he stepped out of that, when he was having to relate from that space to other people, then things got a little difficult. It wasn't so easy for him. He could coach, he could sing, he could bring people into that space. But when it came to making music with other people, then things were not so easy. But I think for him, writing music was something that you had to do as a musician. But I don't know that there was that inner drive that he had to express himself. He could do it, he was very good at it. It was immaculate. I mean, it was beautifully written. But I don't know, maybe if he hadn't had to leave Germany, maybe if he'd gone straight into what he wanted, which was a job conducting opera at an opera house in Germany somewhere, he would have followed the path of somebody, say Mahler, who had conducting during the opera season and in the summer would sit and write symphonies. I don't know. I mean, the world didn't turn out that way. He did come back to composing later in his life, but that was actually, I mean, I knew about it. I knew about those pieces and the pieces that he wrote. I mean, like I think it was a concert piece for violin and viola and orchestra, and then there was Aucassin and Nicolette. I was not living, I was away by then, so I heard about it. I wasn't sort of involved or close to the process of it. I went to one concert, I think in a school near Hammersmith, or part of the Barnes Music Club, I don't remember which, one of the pieces. And I must say, I wasn't excited by it, because at that time, I was so wrapped up in Stockhausen kind of music and stuff, it was like sort of, oh, this is old. So I mean, what I have to feel about it, it really doesn't matter. You know, it was like, but yes, he did find that again in the end. He wrote songs for my sister Barbara and things like that. So obviously, I mean, I can't really say anything about it, but yes, he did come back, and I think that was probably very, very nice for him. When he was in Germany, when he finished his studies at the Hochschule in piano playing, and he did, I think, a year, maybe a couple of years in the conducting class, and he also had done 1 year at the university. That's when the Nazis came to power in Germany. His father had to leave immediately because his father was Jewish and also a prominent man in Berlin. He was a well-known architect and also a member of a group called the Novembergruppe, which was slightly socialist, and I mean that was a death sentence, so he hot-footed right out away. Peter, being the son of a servant of the fatherland, you see, his father had served in the First World War in the army, was a servant of the fatherland. He had to run for his life, but nevertheless, Dad was allowed to carry on. There's the idiocy of the whole thing. He said that he was at the Hochschule, and for example, people were just disappearing. The director of the Hochschule was Franz Schreker. I met his widow later on when I studied in Berlin. But Schreker was a well-known composer at the time of operas, and one day he just wasn't there anymore. He was dismissed. There was an announcement that he was no longer the director, and that broke his heart. And very shortly after he died. And Peter said, you just noticed, you looked around, and somebody wasn't there anymore. And then eventually there was a book produced by the Ministry of Culture. Frick was the Minister of Kultur, and it was called Das Judentum in Musik. And it was a list of Jews who were not allowed to be given work and paid, and he was listed in that book. He said he said he was very honored to be listed in such exalted company. I think were his words about that. Listed along with Peter next door to Gershwin, and then Schoenberg was in that book, and we actually had a copy of that book at home. So it started to become dangerous. And he had this lovely friendship with Lotte, and through her friends got an invitation to come to England. And that's really all I know about it. I know that he arrived in England with 2 shillings in his pocket. His mother had to stay in Berlin. Later on, she was bombed out. His sister Anneliese, I think, went to Nuremberg, where she found work, and later on, after the war, she went to the United States. His mother came to England after the war. She was not Jewish, I mean, so she simply suffered from being alone, probably penniless, and bombed out of her apartment, and she came in 1946. Carl and Lotte, they also, they stayed in Germany, but they were in Berlin throughout the war. They came to England, I think, in 1948. And I knew them. I mean, we would visit them every Easter. They would come to visit every Christmas. I mean, they were like clearly closest friends. I mean, beloved friends. And they ended up, I remember thinking of the place in North London, the Abbey Arts Centre, where they lived with a community of artists. I mean, we spent a lot of time together, and it turned out that later on we discovered that Peter had been sending them money and supporting them. The gift was repaid. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Lotte taught me to paint in oils as a teenager. But somehow Carl, I had a wonderful relationship. He was a real friend. And I remember doing a painting, an oil painting of a hill, which I gave to him. And he put up on his wall. And of course, being a community of artists, the other people would come in and visit. And Carl told me, he said, Joseph, he came in, he looked at your painting. He said, very interesting, a Zen painting. And he said, I didn't tell him it was yours. and I remember Carl painting a map of Tibet. And he said it was very important because all the other maps stopped short. The map of India stopped short, the map of China stopped short. So I don't know what my connection with Carl was. Maybe we were ancient Tibetans meeting again. I don't know. I mean, but there was a lovely connection there. We would visit them regularly. I remember doing Easter egg hunts at the art centre, and Lotte would decorate the boiled eggs and hide them all over the garden and things like that. And of course I watched them at work. Lotte made, the way she made her movies, it was with cutouts, and with black paper, and they were jointed. And then they'd sit on top of a light table with the light coming from underneath. And to get the movement, there was the figure on the table, a camera mounted above, click, move the figure, click, move the figure, click. And that's how they did their movies. And, oh yes, I mean, Star of Bethlehem was gorgeous, but there were many other movies. I mean, like, there was one of Entführung, the Seraglio, which I think was the first one where she did color figures. And no, that was fascinating. I mean, that was like, yeah, they're really making something. And I did a lot of painting as a teenager, and I was very inspired by that. As I said, Lotte was the one who taught me to paint in oils. I'm pretty sure he made music for her movie on Carmen and for Entführung. And I'm not sure of the names of the others, and also I'm not quite sure, I mean, when those were made. I mean, we could probably look that up. Or get in touch with the Lotte Reiniger Trust. The only one I remember specifically was the Star of Bethlehem, which was in 1955, and I remember him in the process of doing that. I remember him talking about that, because we were on holiday and he'd come back and we knew that was happening. And then we saw the movie, I mean, which was absolutely beautiful. You see, the early famous movies of Lotte's, like Prince Ahmed, I mean, that was before they connected. So he didn't do the music for that. That I would encourage you to watch if you haven't seen it. It's marvelous. I mean, Lotte, her cutouts were exquisite. I'll tell you the sort of things that happened. Lotte would come for Christmas, and she'd say, what would you like? And she'd get a piece of paper, and out would come her scissors, snip, 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 and there is a ballet dancer for Mary. And then she'd say to my brother Philip, what do you want? He said, well, how about a drunk? Out would come the piece of paper, snip, 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 snip. And then there's a drunk in the gutter. I have some of her cutouts on my walls. And in fact, it was marvelous to see those videos of the interview that he did a couple of years before his death, because in the second section of that, they go through the house, and you can see some of Lotte's cutouts there. But I watched her in action. I mean, it was incredible. She was big, she was like heavy, but her hands were so tiny and delicate. And the way she worked the scissors, she cut straight and moved the paper. She didn't cut round. It was like snip. And Carl, of course, was the producer for her movies. He had been an assistant to Jean Renoir, the filmmaker, the son of Auguste Renoir, the painter. And I remember seeing this one film, La Grande Illusion, which I think is a great movie. It's about the First World War. The English speak English, the Germans speak German, and the French speak French. And this one marvelous moment, dramatic moment, where the English the captain is captive and trying to escape, and the German, Erich von Stahlheim, he talks to him in English. It's like, and Carl had a little part in that. So it's like, yeah, I've seen him in his element. And Carl would tell stories. I mean, Carl was a great storyteller. And he'd tell stories. And Lotte would say, "No, Carl, it was not like that." And Carl would say, "No, yeah, but it makes a better story." So yes, they were clearly most beloved friends. Joe and Winnie Hodgkinson were good friends, and I think Joe was in the Arts Council. And I don't really know much about professional, and I don't think it was professional. I think they were friends. Of course, Peter was very good about keeping in touch with all the people he worked with. I mean, for example, he and Elizabeth Schwarzkopf were at the Hochschule at the same time. And Schwarzkopf came to London in, I think, 1948, after the war. She'd been in Berlin, and sang at Covent Garden. And they did lots of concerts together. Of course, I don't remember that directly. I was only 3 at the time. But every year on her birthday, he would call her up and play on the piano, the most recent things that he'd been doing. So it was like they kept a connection. In fact, I had the sad duty of writing to her after he died. She lasted a little bit longer than he did. But that was the sort of connection that he kept up all his life. Joe and Winnie were friends. They were two of the people who would be invited on Christmas Eve and things like that, like Carl and Lotte. I don't know about other friends. I think there were a lot of colleagues. I mean, there were certainly a lot of people, singers, who admired him. And later on, there were quite a few people who were sort of groupies, I think. You know, his entourage and people you'd expect to see coming to all the concerts. I was more involved with family. And my mother being one of 7 children and I being one of 25 grandchildren, it was quite a tribe. So family gatherings was always that. I'm not sure that he was terribly happy about that. I don't think he really... Family meant him and his family. I mean, he didn't have family growing up. It was him and his mother and his sister, and he was the one holding it all together. He was very happy to have Mum and the 4 of us, and that was it. That was really as much as he wanted to go with family. But that was my world. So I wasn't terribly, sort of not thinking too much about, you know, Dad's always got somebody there. If somebody came to the house for a lesson, they'd probably have tea in the kitchen, and it was quite likely that I'd be sitting there and listen to the conversation. But I mean, this was, you know, I mean, so of course I knew Heather Harper and Janet Baker and the people from the Glyndebourne Chorus who came to the house. I mean, they were, you know. I think he was very much liked, I mean, by orchestral players. I mean, for example, Richard Temple Savage, who was the clarinetist in the Covent Garden Orchestra, was a friend, because we would go out and visit them at their house in Woking, and that connection went on for quite a long time. And Valerie is Richard's wife, and then I remember Bimmy and Josephine, I think. I mean, they were, you know, the kids. I mean, so there was a family that he connected with, that we connected with as a family. Hard to think of many others, but there probably were. But I mean, basically his life was work. And if it happened to fit with that, I mean, so hundreds of people came through the house, mostly singers. I remember a few fairly well-known, I mean, I remember one time, I was a student, he played all the Beethoven violin sonatas with Spivakovsky. I think a fairly well-known name at the time, and they did a series of concerts at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, which with, I guess 6 concerts, 2 sonatas each concert, and then in each concert Spivakovsky played one of the Bach solo sonatas on a curved Baroque bow. And I remember that it was very interesting to me, because at that time I remember Spivakovsky coming to the house one day, and I was practicing on Dad's piano and playing the Liszt E-flat piano concerto. I was learning that. And Spivakovsky coming in and saying, "Oh, very good, very good. And if you can play all the Chopin studies, then, you know, I mean, you've got everything." That was the idea, that if you learn the piano, if you can play all the Chopin studies, you've got it. But what tickled me is that for all the time that that Dad would be arguing against the very contemporary music and the experimental stuff and the things that I was doing, like the Stockhausen, the Cornelius Cardew, things like that. When one day I heard him talking to Spivakovsky and impressing on Spivakovsky the importance of Stockhausen, I thought, oh, that's interesting. He can do that too. Yes, exactly, which leads into an interesting thing. In 1972, I think, very shortly before he left the BBC, at the Promenade concerts, they did a performance of Stockhausen's Carré. And Stockhausen, Carré means square. So it's a composition for 4 groups of musicians in which are embedded singers. So basically 4 orchestras and 4 choirs. And the idea of it, it's like the experience of electronic music and quadraphonic sound, hearing that, putting that back and doing it with live instruments. And in order to rehearse that and prepare that, they needed, the performances with 4 conductors, but to prepare that, they needed four choir directors, one to work with each choir. And my dad at that time was director of the BBC Chorus, and he knew that I was involved or interested in this kind of music. So he got me in as one of the choir directors. And in fact, he called a meeting at his house for me to explain to the other 3, it ended up being just the other 2, what the piece was about. And there were some interesting things with that piece, which were not conventional, because this is one place where working in those days in electronic music, one worked with tape. The thing about an electronic device or a tape recorder is that once you start a sound, it'll go on until you intervene to stop it. It's very different from you blow a note on the flute and it will stop when you run out of air. Or you play a note on the piano, you have the attack and it will just decay. With the electronic, it's a different sort of mentality. So instead of feeling pulses from the heart or rhythm of breathing, you start measuring durations. And you think in terms of lengths of tape. So the score was notated with a sound starting and being drawn as a continuous streak until it stops, with a notation of 10 seconds or 2.3 seconds. And that was, it's just a different way of notation. And so you have to think differently. And the other thing he did, which was very interesting, various effects that you would get by filtering and modulation of sound. He notated and then said, this is the Stockhausen notation, and they said approximate pitches. Well, of course, you give that to the BBC Chorus. They cannot sing approximate pitches. They will pitch everything exactly right, absolutely perfect. I mean, this was mind-blowing to me. But that was a very interesting experience, working with those singers, because they were unbelievably good, and I think hated it, and were wishing that they were singing Schubert or Verdi. But I thought, yeah, that's the life of a professional musician. That's what happens if you play in an orchestra. I think that's one of the reasons why I decided not to play in an orchestra, although I certainly had the option. But that was one occasion that I actually worked with him, and it was beautiful because he could see what I knew, and he could see that it was something that was valuable in the work. So I had the respect of that. I tell you a very funny thing. I remember playing the Bach Fourth Brandenburg. It's 2 flutes and violin. And we did a performance at Westminster School, so I guess I was probably 16. And he came to that concert. And he had a very high opinion of me as a flute player. It was like, yeah, he knew, he respected that. And afterwards he said to me, this was really amazing. You played exactly the same way in the concert as you do at home. And I went, well, why should I not? It was like, for him doing a performance was probably a scary thing. For me, getting up and playing music was so automatic and natural. Why should one play differently? And, you know, I mean, like we're having a conversation now. This is perfectly ordinary. I mean, why is this any different from any other speaking? And that was a surprise. I think that Stockhausen with the BBC is probably the only time I actually worked with him. Although I do remember as a kid working marking parts with him, and when we were down at Dartington, and he did the amateur chorus, and I think we did the Rossini Petite Messe Solennelle, and I remember sitting with him marking the voice parts and stuff like that. So I mean, I was around, I was there for a lot of things, but mostly as a spectator or as a sort of silent partner. That was mostly the situation. Dartington was one of the most exciting things musically in my teenage. The first time, I mean, he was invited there. William Glock, who was head of BBC Music, ran Dartington. I mean, so the first time I went there, I was probably 12 or 13. I just missed Stravinsky, but I got Benjamin Britten and George Malcolm playing Britten's Missa Brevis with 3 of the Westminster choir boys. I met so many amazing musicians there. I heard the Juilliard String Quartet for the first time, and composers, people like Luciano Berio, Luigi Nono with their Bruno Maderna. I went to their workshops and lectures. Yeah, and then later on I went under my own steam when I was a little older and played in some of the piano classes, and yeah, it was a bit like when I was a little younger, when Peter was at Glyndebourne. I'd go down at half term and sit in all the rehearsals and see people like Carl Ebert at work. I mean, that was magic. Carl Ebert producing Rake's Progress and showing when at the very beginning Nick Shadow comes in, and it was Ottokar Kraus who was Nick Shadow, and Ebert says, no. When you open the gate, we need to know all your intentions. And he came in and he opened the gate, and I tell you, the way he did it, that sent shivers down your spine. I mean, it was like, ah. So I got to sit in on some amazing people. I mean, so Dartington was one of those places. Oh, I met Severino Gazzoloni there and played in his flute class. That was fantastic. I met people like Charles Rosen, the pianist. It was just, but you know, I mean, it was like family. You were just hanging out together. Hans Keller's lectures on all the Haydn string quartets and things like that. I mean, it was very funny, very tremendously witty and interesting, and I mean, that's just what comes to mind. Yeah, later on, I mean, I had the privilege, when Peter was at the BBC, of sitting in on the recording sessions when Boulez was recording the Webern cantatas. And again, you know, sort of these are the people you hang out with, and so you have a chat with him. But you don't think there's anything unusual about that. So I grew up just feeling that was these are the people that I'm connected with. So through him, I mean, but I never thought about it like that. It was just automatic, just natural. Hans Keller had a connection with Peter much earlier because they had met at the internment camp on the Isle of Man. I mean, in 1939. I mean, it seems so ironic. I mean, that Peter had escaped from Germany, and then, of course, he's looked at as an enemy alien. He was, first of all, the internment was somewhere in the north of England, I forget, before they were sent to the Isle of Man. But that camp on the Isle of Man, he did a lot of music, and he met a lot of musicians, like the Amadeus Quartet. They were all there. But I think that was his, and I think Paul, I'm not sure if Paul Hamburger was there or not, I mean, but again, and he did lots of piano recitals. Of course, his memory was unbelievable. You have no idea. I mean, it was terrifying. I mean, he just remembered everything, and he would sit down and say this and play it. I mean, so on the Isle of Man, he reconstructed at least three or maybe four complete recital programs. I remember later on, I was in Hawaii already, and I heard that they were going to do Electra at the opera. And so I came back and I mentioned to him, and I said, you know, they're going to do Electra at the opera. And he said, oh, really, how? And I said, I don't know. And then he sat down and played and sang the first 10 minutes of the opera. And he probably hadn't looked at it in 35 years. I mean, I remember when they did it at Covent Garden. But I mean, it was like that. Or I bring the flute fantasy on Traviata, and we're playing together, and he stops and says, you know, it doesn't go like that. It goes yum bum bum bum. You couldn't get away with anything. I said, oh yeah, that's much better. Let's change it. No, unbelievable memory. I mean, and you know, a conversation with him, and as soon as you mentioned a piece of music, he's at the piano. He'll play it for you. Yeah. He was definitely against the idea of my becoming a pianist, because he himself was a prodigy. He started at the age of 8. By the time he was 10, he could sit down and play the whole of Magic Flute from memory. I mean, that was normal for him. So the idea that you actually could learn it was nowhere in his psyche. I mean, you were born with it, or you don't bother. I mean, that was one side of it. And the other side of it was that he felt that life as a musician was difficult. And he saw that I was good at the flute, and he knew that I was good at mathematics and physics, and so he thought I would have an easier life. And maybe I would have done. But it wouldn't have been as rich or as interesting or as real. I mean, so there was, to me, there was never a choice. It was like, by the time I knew I had to do it when I was 17. It's like, God, I've got to get on with it. I can't wait anymore. And I did that for 10 years and did what I had to do. And I mean, I'm still working at the piano now. And it was beautiful because I had done it. And he, by the time I was in Boulder, and I sent him a tape of my improvisations. And I knew that wasn't, you know, he didn't really consider that music. I mean, because there was a certain part of him that, you know, it had to be stamped and sealed and said made in Germany and to be real music. But he listened to it and he said, wow, you could play anything. So he came round to the idea, and at the end we had such a lovely time playing piano duets together, playing Mozart, and it was like, yeah, okay, we've done the full circle and we've come home. I mean, so, but no, he was not in favor. So I had to work pretty hard to. Well, he grew up in the 20s, when things went after the revolution, so to speak. Things were the neoclassical time, and people were looking back to the past to get a kind of a balance. And so I think probably also to do with his upbringing and the insecurity. It was safer to play Beethoven than to go and explore new kinds of tonality and things like that. I mean, so certainly the music that he played, he chose to play the piano, I mean, was probably nothing more modern than Brahms and, you know, I mean, César Franck perhaps, or Fauré. I mean, and that was something that related to the traditional language. When he went to the BBC, of course, he was required to do contemporary music. But actually, the truth was, although emotionally he wasn't ready to do it himself, he was always interested. he was always interested in you know, his mind was, he was curious. I remember one time at Dartington, Stefan Volpe, the American composer, was there, and he was talking. I liked Stefan Volpe's music, by the way, and he gave lectures on Webern and things like that, and Peter was there, and he said, that was really interesting. You know, this was something that had touched him. And he actually liked being around composers that went, I mean, he was there when Luciano Berio was there and giving talks. And so he would go and listen, even though he didn't really he wasn't ready to say, okay, I'm going to embrace this and do it. For me, this was exciting. I mean, I borrowed Berio's copy of his flute sequenza. This was 1959. It wasn't even published in those days. So I borrowed his copy and wrote it down by hand and played it. You know, I was ready to go for that. But I think, well, I mean, Peter did do modern music, of course. I mean, he did Peter Grimes. He was supposed to do the first performance of Billy Budd. I mean, in the end, Ben took the first performance, but he did all the rest. I mean, so there was contemporary music that he was definitely 100% with. But it was interesting when he went to the BBC, knowing what I knew and my feeling about music, he came to me and asked advice about what pieces to do. I mean, it was not like a collaboration. I mean, he just wanted some information and was very happy to get it. And I think he was very excited, because then he would do a new piece and he would say, Martin, come and listen, I want to show we're doing this. And he'd show me an early piece by Webern or something like that, and then go off and do it with the choir. And his work with that BBC chorus, I mean, of course he did in the same utterly painstaking and immaculate way, and with total understanding of the music. And I mean, he had to make sure he understood. I mean, he did some songs by Messiaen, I believe with Adele Lee, and he got the copies and he was practicing the music, and he said, I think these are wrong notes. And he wrote to Messiaen and said, Le Maître, I think we have some mistakes and Messiaen wrote back and said, Mr. Gellhorn, you're absolutely right. I mean, and so, I mean, whatever he did, he would do in that way. And he got tremendous accolades from Messiaen later on, and from Stravinsky, and preparing the Webern with Boulez. And I mean, they all said that he was the most immaculate, perfect, the best choir director they'd worked with. It was amazing to work with. I mean, everything had to be just so. I mean, it had to be just so, otherwise it didn't work. So in that way, he didn't, you know, likes or dislikes were not really, he was going to find the music in it, whatever it is. I mean, I got that from him. I played the Schoenberg Piano Concerto when I was a student in York, learnt the idiom, wrote my wind quintet in the idiom. When I came to look at the full score, corrected the wrong notes. You know, it's sort of afraid that runs in the family. And he was very pleased with it. He was pleased with doing that. Although then, of course, he'd go back home and play Bach and Mozart. You know. But that's natural. I think that's. But he was always interested. When I did my Messiahs I had a job at a church in Central Union Church in Honolulu, and I had to do Messiah. I mean, and I think I did things that he would never have expected. And I think his spirit was there going, what is he doing? That's interesting. But while I was a kid at home and I was playing on the piano, he'd come in when I was practicing and go, what is that? You know, Busoni arrangement of a Bach chorale prelude, or a Liszt piece that he didn't know, or I was actually involved in the first London performance of Gordon Cross's piece, The Covenant of the Rainbow, which is for choir and organ and piano duet. And I was one of the pianists. John Aldous Choir did that, the first London performance. I actually knew Gordon from Oxford, but visits to Oxford. And I was practicing that piece in the front room. And of course, Peter comes in and says, what is that? That's interesting. And later on, of course, he did it with his choir. I mean, so he was open, but it just needed a bit of a little shoving and wait a bit of time. So. I never had the kind of conversation where he would really look at the whole of his life. I think that the early times were so painful, he didn't want to revisit. I mean, it was the same thing with his dad, who came to live with us at the end of his life and had a very interesting life. I mean, in Berlin, going to South America, in Argentina, leaving when the military coup happened, and I remember talking to him. This is my father's father, and saying, "Well, don't you want to write about something?" And he did his memoirs, and his memoirs was enough on a piece of paper this size. And it's like, we don't want to. And he said, nobody's interested. And it wasn't that nobody was interested. He didn't want to look at it again. And I think my father had a lot of that. I remember him walking into the kitchen at the age of 88 or 89 saying, "One must always think of tomorrow." You know, I mean, that was his way. We're not going to worry about what happened before. We're going to keep going. I mean, if you think of it, it is so strange. Can you imagine that the city that you were born in is now a different city in a different country with people speaking another language? I mean, how do you deal with that? I don't know how you deal with that. I mean, I don't live in London anymore, but I know exactly where I came from, and that hasn't moved. I mean, it's like, so that was a difficulty. I think I did have a conversation with him very near the end, when I had dealt with all the problems that we had had. I mean, we fought tooth and nail when I was a teenager. And I had cleared all that. That was done. I had spent time in San Diego. I looked at all the music that I mentioned, all his music, and came to terms with that. And then I spent a whole load of time basically listening to all the stuff that had happened when I was a teenager, and his voice saying this and this and this and this. And I had to be very clear. I mean, I had to do this for myself, because a lot of it was not helpful for me. And a lot of it, there was a huge amount of wisdom there. So I had to look at everything and say, okay, yes, I'll go with that and not with that. And at the end of that process for me, I went back to England so that I could say to him, "Dad, I love you." And all that stuff is finished. It's done. We are done. And we had a conversation. And one of the things he said is that he really regretted that he didn't get a position which was corresponding to his ability. And I said to him, "But look at the way you behave. You get angry with people. You talk behind people's backs. They don't like that." And I said a few things to him, and he responded by just as if he'd been punched in the face. And it was like something that I wish somebody had had the courage to tell him 40 years earlier, that you don't behave like that if you want somebody to give you a position. Nobody doubted his ability as a musician. I was so disappointed. I mean, I thought that the disappointment, the bad temper, all that stuff stayed at home. I thought he didn't take it out. But when I was 19, I met a pianist, a wonderful pianist, Andrei Tchaikovsky. And Andrei played 2 recitals at Dartington. I remember we met at Dartington. And in one of those recitals, he played the Beethoven Opus 106, the Hammerklavier. And Andrei played to me. And I just felt that the fugue, that incredible, crazy fugue, somehow wasn't right. And I remember Peter playing that fugue to me, because I had looked at a contemporary piece which had bits of it, and Peter said, "Oh, do you know what it comes from?" Pulls the music, sits down, plays it, and you go, wow. And so I suggested to Andrei that he play it to my dad. And Andrei had a recording at the BBC and mentioned Peter. and came back to Dartington, and I said, well, did you connect? And Andre said, oh no, I don't want to play to him. I heard he has a real bad temper. And I went, oh, that doesn't work. And so the conversation I had with him was about things like that. And, you know, we said real things. And it was good for both of us. And the next day, he's sitting at the breakfast table and saying, I'm so glad we spoke yesterday. And then he's back into his old mode. But the thing that changed was really quite extraordinary. And this was, I forget the order of things. But anyway, by the time I was there for Mum's 80th birthday, I'm in the house, and the girls come to me, Mary and Barbara, they come to me and they say, we don't think this is a suitable piece. Dad won't listen to us. Will you talk to him? I said, sure. So I go and talk to him and I say, well, the girls think that this is not good, maybe we should do this. And he says, oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, that was what had changed. I had dropped my stuff. I wasn't reacting. So there was nowhere for it to land. And in that way, I mean, that was a miracle. And that's how we connected at the end. And there were things like when Mum was sick, she had a stroke, she was ill, and I said, and I remember Barbara coming to me and saying, oh, we should get somebody in the house to help, but Dad doesn't want anybody in. So please talk to him. So I said to Dad, I said, look, Barbara is concerned, you know, that Mum needs a little bit of help, and you really aren't, you know, I mean, you can't do that yourself. And he said, oh, you're right, yes, I'm not getting any younger. And it was like there was no argument anymore, and that was a miracle. So in that way, we came together. Yes, we did have a little bit of conversation, but he wasn't one to reflect. He would bring in an anecdote if it related specifically to something that's happening now, if it was to make that clear. And at the end of his life, he would go and visit a friend in Berlin, a composer called Friedrich Zehm, who none of us knew, and he would go off for the weekend, and he wouldn't say anything about it. But there was something, obviously, where he was trying to connect a little bit with his roots. And that was nice. Berlin, at least, was still Berlin. I don't remember if he knew Mariana in Germany, but certainly when he was in England, he was playing a lot with Mariana Lidke, violinist. I mean, I remember them playing together. I remember them playing, I mean, I guess that was when I heard the Schubert C major fantasy, and I remember them, they would often play the last Beethoven violin sonata, the G major, I think it's opus 896. That one was one of the standard things. So my first knowing of Mariana was of her coming to the house and them playing music together. And then I heard, I mean, then Dad would say, oh yes, people thought we were going to get married. It was that close. And he told me that the reason he could never marry her was because she was a Catholic, and he couldn't even allow the thought of his children being brought up Catholic. It's interesting. I mean, different, you know, what makes the decisions? I mean, it's a different world. I think feelings were not an issue. I mean, were not something that you considered when making life decisions for that generation. I mean, they had to survive. You can't go with your feelings. You've got to look and see what is, you know, how you're gonna breathe and eat and those kind of things. But no, I know that Peter and Mariana were very close enough that other people considered that they might get married, and he was quite clear that that was not going to happen. So Mariana was very close friend of the family. And in fact, when I went to study in Berlin when it was 1964, first of all, I went to stay with a colleague of Peter's, Klaus Billing, whose wife, Alice Gregor, was a dancer and had studied dance with my grandfather's second wife. I mean, it was like, go to Berlin, meet the family. I stayed with Billing for a while, and then I spent quite a bit of time staying with Marianne's mother, Frau Liedke, in Zehlendorf. So I had quite a good connection with that side of the family. I mean, Marianne stayed a friend forever. Was wonderful the way they connected. And Marianne actually, I think, played at Dad's funeral. She played the violin. She has since then died, I'm afraid. But yes, this was a regular visitor to the house, a very close friend. If you saw the interviews, the videos of those interviews, and of course it ends up with them sitting in the kitchen having tea, that was, where the conversation happened, and where, if anybody came to the house for a lesson, very often sit in the kitchen and have tea first. But I mean, many conversations with Marianne, yes. That was a very important connection for him. I mean, I think probably at the beginning when he came to England, I mean, this was a way that he got known because they did a lot of playing together. The immediate family, I mean, as his mother came to England in 1946, stayed with us for a short while. It didn't work out for her to be in the family. It was too difficult. So my father found her a little apartment in the Bolton Gardens, not far. We were in Fulham Road and she was just down the road. And so I would go visit. And then I remember she died. She was in hospital in 1950, and I think she was only 60 or early 60s. And we were on holiday in the south of France when we heard the news of that. His sister Anneliese went to America in 1945 or just after the war, chaperoning children evacuating, and she worked in a theatrical agency. And so she had a little connection with the other branch of the Gellhorns. My grandfather, Alfred Gellhorn, had a brother, George, who went to America in 1900 and married, I think, a socialite American there, and had, I think, is it 4 or 5 children? The eldest, George, who was a doctor. Then there was Walter, whom I met in London it was just before I went to the Commune in Oregon. So this must have been 1982. And he was became a professor of law at Columbia University and wrote the textbooks. And his wife, Kitty, was absolutely delightful. And so they came to London to see all the shows. Then there was Martha Gellhorn, the war correspondent in Spain, Hemingway's wife at one time. I met her in London in the 50s, and she came with her then husband, Tommy Matthews, and one of her kids. She had an adopted son, Sandy, and she had another son from Tommy, also Sandy. So there was Sandy Matthews and Sandy Gellhorn. And I forget which one of those boys. He was just a little younger than me. And I remember that because they brought Dr. Seuss books. And that was my introduction to that. I didn't know her later on in life because I was already away and probably in India when she came. Alfred and Olga. Alfred was the youngest of them. Alfred was a doctor, specialized in cancer research. He was head of the medical department in Philadelphia. And when he came, I met, I think, 2 of his daughters, Edna and Maria, who were then teenagers, and they were in London. And I think later on Maria died of cancer, and that was very painful for him. And I went to stay with them. I was already a sannyasin. I was already a disciple of Bhagwan's. So when was it? 1978, I guess, was my first trip to America. And I just missed Annalisa, my aunt, my dad's sister. She had died just a few months earlier. We had spoken occasionally on the phone, but I think she didn't like what happened in India, and sort of she felt I was going off with a foreign religion, sort of. She didn't really approve. So unfortunately I missed her. But I stayed with Alfred and Olga in their apartment overlooking Central Park, and then I was again the one to call him and let him know that Peter had died. I think if you see the video interview, behind his shoulder on the mantelpiece is a photo of Martha, who he said was definitely his favorite cousin. There are other Gellhorns in the States, because when I did a bit of research some years ago, I must have had time. I don't know how I had time, because I certainly don't have time now. I went on Ancestry.com and discovered that there was a whole immigration of Gellhorns registered in the 1850 census in Ohio. But I never found any connection. My father would talk about a Catherine Gellhorn who lived in Spokane, Washington, and mentioned that because the Rajneesh commune that I was in Oregon, next door. I never made a connection then because I was busy doing what I was doing. But then in 2002, I was then the choir director at the Unitarian Church in Honolulu. And I started going to Unitarian musicians conferences. And the first one was I went to was in Vancouver, I think 2002. And somebody came and saw my name tag, Gellhorn, and said, "Oh, did you know Catherine Gellhorn? She was the matriarch of the Unitarian Church in Spokane, Washington." And I said, "No, I'm sorry, I didn't. I knew of her, but I never met her." And again, it was too late to actually make a connection. So there are Gellhorns sort of around, but not a lot of them. I think that's... Then I think Alfred's daughter Edna, she went to California, but again, I have no connection. Mary has been in touch with Alfred. I mean, I think he died now, but she had more connection with him later on. When Peter died, it was very important to me that his compositions be preserved, but also be accessible. And so I'm very happy that the British Library was ready to accept them in its collection. And I had very nice conversations with Nicholas Bell, who did a fabulous job cataloguing and organizing all the materials. So that made me very happy. When I heard about this grant to work on his pieces, I was absolutely blown away and delighted, and I was so happy for him, because it gives a little bit of recognition in an area that he didn't have in his lifetime, and I think would have made him tremendously happy. So yes, I am personally absolutely delighted that you are doing this work, and it's wonderful, and I'm so happy to be able to talk to you about it, and so happy that some of the workshops happen to coincide with my visit, so I can come and listen. Yeah, I mean, no, I think it's wonderful. It's fantastic.